In my last Heinlein video, which you can watch here if you haven't seen it, I asked you to let me know if you'd want a video on Heinlein's view on women. Well, a lot of people said, why yes, I'd like you to do that video. Because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. When I say that Heinlein's views on women are outdated, some people jump to the conclusion that I meant misogynistic. Let me say, for the record, that I personally do not believe Heinlein was a misogynist. So if that's the video you're expecting, you're probably going to be disappointed. But again, this is just my opinion. You may have a different opinion, and that's okay because opinions aren't right or wrong. They're just opinions. Now, I will say about Heinlein, you can easily cherry pick quotes to prove a point one way or the other because his views were all over the place. Though I think overall you can trace an evolution in his views. First, let's define misogyny so we're all on the same page. The dictionary definition is, quote, dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women. Now, I don't think there's any evidence in Heinlein's writings that he had a dislike or contempt of women. But what about ingrained prejudice against women? I think there's a good case for ingrained prejudice concerning women, but not against women. What I mean is that his prejudice, at least from my reading, was that he often went the opposite direction, that women were superior to men, at least in some manner, and that's called benevolent prejudice, or in this case, benevolent sexism. For example, calling a society where all lawyers and politicians should be women on the grounds that there is a mysterious female power that men don't possess. He often introduced women who ran rings around her male counterparts, and it's never quite clear why, except that the man in question just didn't seem to know how to act around women. And you rarely saw female villains. Women were presented as somehow superior to men, but not for any concrete reasons, but because they had an almost magical feminine mystique.
The magnificence that comes out of your eyes and your voice and the way you stand there and the way you walk. You're lit from within, Tracy. You've got fires banked down in you. Hearth fires and holocausts.
I don't seem to have made of bronze.
So if you're asking me if Heinlein was misogynistic, I'd say no, I don't believe so. But if you're asking me if he was sexist, that's a different question. Then yeah, he was a product of his time, and even though he may have leaned towards benevolence, it was still sexism, at least from the standpoint of the 21st century. Again, you may have a totally different view, and that's fine. Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. But also his view on women evolved. Heinlein's writing career spanned from the 30s to the 80s. That's a 50-year period. 50 years. He grew up when women couldn't vote. Think of that. And he lived through the women's liberation movement. He witnessed the first woman astronaut, Supreme Court justice, vice presidential candidate to a major party. So of course, his views changed and evolved, which I think can be traced through his writing. So what I'd like to do is look at his career in 3 stages: before the 1960s, from 1960 to about 1980, and then from 1980 and beyond. So, the period of the 1960s, the 40s and 50s really, Heinlein was mainly known for what is called his juveniles, books primarily aimed at teen boys. Heck, one of his books, Farmer in the Sky, was serialized in the Boy Scouts magazine. And by the way, this was before the categories of middle grade and young adult, before they even existed. But here the main characters were around 16 to 18. Yes, he did write adult novels during this time, Methuselah's Children, Puppet Masters, Double Star, which won a Hugo, but I think it's instructive to look at the juveniles because this is how he presented women to the upcoming generation of males. The roles of women in his juveniles didn't really go beyond wives and mothers or potential wives and mothers, but Heinlein, for his time, strived to be progressive. For example, showing a future where races were equal and worked together going back as far as Space Cadet, one of his very early juveniles published in 1948. As far as female characters were concerned, he didn't want to present a typical damsel in distress. He wanted to show strong, powerful female characters, again, progressive for the time. But the strength and power of these women were through their feminine mystique or female guile. Through the lens of the 21st century, they may not play as well-rounded women, but more as an example of the times, with an exception I'll get to in a bit. But let's look at some examples. Starman Jones, published in 1953, is about Max Jones, a teenager who runs away from home and bluffs his way onto the crew of a passenger spaceship. He subsequently rises through the ranks. Heinlein loved a good Horatio Alger storyline. But here, one of the passengers is a pretty girl named Ellie, who they have a somewhat flirtatious relationship. And Ellie is smart. She's a master of chess. Through guile, she helps Max advance in the ranks. But her biggest goal in life is to get married. By the way, I love the ending of this story because Ellie and Max don't end up together. They go their separate ways, and Ellie marries someone else, but they remain friends. Which, by the way, I love because that's how typically teenage romances end. It feels more real than some of the modern YA romances today where the boy and girl are soulmates bound together literally for eternity. Another version of Ellie pops up in The Star Beast, published in 1954. This was one of my favorite novels growing up, but rereading it as an adult, the plot and pacing aren't as amazing as I remembered. But anyway, that's not the subject here. The story is about a teen boy named John Thomas who has inherited an extraterrestrial pet that his space explorer great-grandfather brought back from one of his missions in outer space. And the creature is named Lummox, and since John Thomas's father passed away, he has been the Star Beast's caretaker, which has grown to be the size of a small dinosaur. And it's threatened to be taken away by the local government and sold to a zoo. Anyway, John Thomas has a friend named Betty, who is very similar to Ellie in Starman Jones. Betty can pretty much take charge of John Thomas. He doesn't know how to deal with her. She's fast-talking and quick-thinking. Betty is so self-assured and confident that she inserts herself into a trial where the men indulge her because she's such a smart young girl, but don't really seem to take her seriously. Betty eventually helps save John Thomas and the Star Beast and kind of tricks him into marrying her. Well, he doesn't resist, but again, progressive for the time, but maybe not so much from our perspective. Finally, let's look at Tunnel in the Sky, published in 1955. This is the most progressive look at women in his juveniles. The story is about Rod Walker, a teen boy training to be a colonist, which is a super rigorous program. Earth suffers from gross overpopulation, and the best of the best are sent through wormholes or tunnels in the sky to colonize planets. Anyway, Rod's sister is a minor character, but finally a woman who isn't a wife or mother. She's an assault captain in an all-female space marine unit called the Amazons. What? But the major female character is a young woman named Jackie. Rod and Jackie and a bunch of other young people are stranded on a planet during a training mission, and it becomes sort of a Lord of the Flies situation. Okay, when they're first placed on this planet, they decide to pair up with people, and Rod doesn't want to team up with a girl because they're weak. But he teams up with a short little guy named Jack. Surprise! Jack is actually Jacqueline or Jackie. Now, once they realize they are stranded on this planet, they have to form a society of sorts. The boys and girls revert to more traditional roles, insofar that women are more domestic and men are more of the providers and protectors. Some of the young men and women even get married and form households, even though there's a will they, won't they get together tension between Rod and Jackie. They never pair off like some of the others. Because Jackie sort of hovers around this single lady persona for a long period of time, she seems to have more autonomy than the other girls, being Rod's right-hand man, but eventually she does marry one of the other boys, Rod's friend Jim. After the kids are rescued and returned to civilization, Rod recounts that Jackie was his city manager, executive officer, captain of the guard, chief of police. She even hunted, but only because she liked to. But like I said, Jackie does end up marrying someone else and sets up house. And even Rod's sister, the Amazon, gets married in the end. Still, I think this was a super progressive depiction of women for the time, especially being presented to teen boys. Now then, I mentioned an exception earlier in Heinlein's female characters, and that exception are very young girls, prepubescent, before gender roles really come to bear. Heinlein actually did some non-science fiction stories about a young girl named Puddin. Good luck finding those stories. But this type of girl was precocious, mischievous, funny, optimistic, and we see this type in some of his juveniles, notably Farmer in the Sky, about a family of colonists on Ganymede. The main character is Bill, a teen boy, naturally, but he has a younger sister, Peggy, who fits his Heinleinian archetype. But the best example is Have Spacesuit Will Travel, about Kip, a teen boy who wins a spacesuit in a lottery and is then kidnapped by aliens. Well, he meets another kidnap victim, an 11-year-old girl named Pee-wee. Pee-wee is a very well-developed character with little of the limitations of gender roles placed on women that may be found in some of Heinlein's other juveniles, but then again, she hasn't gone through puberty. She's extremely courageous and moral, though Kip does end up having to save her. It's still one of my favorite female characters in the juvenile novels. But this brings us to the 1960s. And before we dive into Stranger in a Strange Land, I want to talk first about Podkayne of Mars, published in 1963, which, in my opinion, is the most realistic, rounded, fully developed female character in all of Heinlein's works. He rarely wrote female main characters, but Podkayne was based on the Puddin character, that feisty, independent young teen girl. I consider Podkayne of Mars to be one of the juveniles because it reads like a middle grade or young adult book, even though it wasn't part of the Scribner Juvenile Collection. Podkayne is a 15-year-old girl who is from a Martian colony family. Her uncle takes her and her brother on a vacation to Venus. Her brother Clark is 11 years old and kind of a sociopath. Now, this is really an interesting presentation of a young woman because there is no romantic B-plot. It's mostly about Podkayne's relationship with her brother. Despite Clark's juvenile delinquent behavior, Podkayne is his protector and confidant and eventually redeemer. Interestingly enough, there's two versions of the ending, one where Podkayne dies, which was in Heinlein's original ending, and one where she is just severely injured. I think most published versions now contain both endings, so choose your own adventure. Okay, Heinlein's biggest success came in 1961 with the publication of Stranger in a Strange Land. This was an adult novel that explored, among other things, sexual liberation or free love. But here, women were not necessarily just wives and mothers. Right off the bat, we are given the rundown of the first Martian exploration crew, who were 4 married couples. And the women had just as many degrees and qualifications as their husbands, like biochemistry, electronics, engineering, geology, and so on. Almost all of them had doctorates, so I think it's interesting that the medical doctor was a man's job and nurse was a woman's. Still, these were women of intelligence and education. But of course, we never saw any of them in action because they were just mentioned in the setup or background, because the story is about one of their offspring, Valentine Michael Smith, the only survivor who was rescued 25 years later. And it's never really established who his actual parents are, since maybe the astronaut couples were swingers. The story is mostly about Valentine Michael Smith's reconciliation between his upbringing by Martians who live on a higher spiritual plane and his homecoming to human civilization. At the time, again, this was a very progressive book, and the women for the time were strong characters, starting with Jill, the nurse, who first helps Michael. And then there's several others, including Anne, who is a first witness, which is a person trained to be objective and truthful. The women are sexually free, and jealousy is something to be conquered. That said, there are passages that many could point to as problematic. Jill says, 9 times out of 10, if a girl gets raped, it's partly her own fault. Now, let's be clear. This is a character speaking, not Heinlein speaking. And since it's a woman saying it, maybe it's something that Heinlein heard women say before, but it's without context. The modern reader is going to have to search for nuance or come to terms with attitudes of the times coloring the story. Also, Jubal Harshaw, who many probably rightly consider the mouthpiece for Heinlein's own philosophy, is an older man surrounded by young women who dote on him. A Heinlein wish fulfillment? I don't know, but it may raise a few eyebrows among modern readers. Okay, let's jump to I Will Fear No Evil, published in 1970. When I read it, it blew me away as such a radical story. It is the ultimate sex reassignment surgery, where an old man's brain is transplanted into the body of a woman. Now, don't get excited that this is about the trans experience. First of all, the man is a billionaire, and this is his way to try to cheat death and extend his life. And he thought his new body would be male. The old man's name is Johann and calls herself Joanne when in the new body. And while Joanne slightly deals with body dysmorphia, the way Heinlein comes to terms with this is that Joanne shares the body with the spirit of the original woman, Eunice. So much of the novel is a conversation between Joanne and Eunice, with units explaining to Joanne how to be a woman, including how having sex with a man is better than with a woman. Of course, the highest goal of being a woman is to have a child, so Joanne Eunice impregnates herself with Johann's frozen sperm. It's a pretty wild story for the time, but again, probably problematic for the modern 21st century reader. Then there's Time Enough for Love, published in 1973, which features Lazarus Long, the immortal human himbo, who turns up in many of Heinlein's books, starting with Methuselah's Children in 1958, and turning up in his very last published book, To Sail Beyond the Sunset, in 1987, which we're going to talk about. Anyway, I like Time Enough for Love and Lazarus Long, but this is a book where Heinlein explores breaking taboos, taboos being artificial human constructs. He did that before with cannibalism in Stranger in a Strange Land. Now he looks at incest. Arguably, he wants to challenge the reader by presenting thought experiments, usually involving time travel, to present situations where two relatives, like mother and son, meet and have sex, because after all, it's just a physical act. And if the incest taboo is about preventing genetic mutation, what if the sex doesn't involve any chance of progeneration? Where's the harm in that? What about sex between clones? This book is often accused as promoting pedophilia because one of the storylines is about a man who raises a young girl like she was his daughter, then through age, regeneration, and time travel, comes back to her as a young man, and they marry. Is it pedophilia if they're both still adults? Anyway, these are thought experiments to challenge readers, and many readers don't want to be challenged, at least in regards to this particular taboo. Now we can jump to the 1980s, when Heinlein returned to writing after a protracted illness. Two of these novels feature a woman protagonist. The first is Friday, published in 1982, and has a female character named Friday, who is a genetically engineered artificial woman who is a spy courier and lives in a polyamorous group marriage. Artificial persons are discriminated against in this novel, so it's an allegory on prejudice, and Friday ends up getting divorced because the other spouses in her group marriage don't want to have a relationship with an artificial person. Now, as progressive as all this sounds, Friday is also sexually assaulted and doesn't seem to mind that much. Things that wouldn't have been so bad if the rapist didn't have bad breath, and later in the novel, the rapist is redeemed. The other novel with a female protagonist is To Sail Beyond the Sunset, which I've mentioned before. This was published in 1987, also Heinlein's last novel, which he wrote at age 79. The main character is Maureen, who is part of the longevity experiments that ended with her son, Lazarus Long, the immortal, who I mentioned was the main character in Time Enough for Love and several other novels. And yes, she is the mother who had an affair with her time-traveling son. And this book is more of Heinlein's exploration into breaking the taboo of incest. Now, if you can get beyond that, I think Maureen may be one of the most realized of the adult women that Heinlein wrote about. And she is kind of the proto-woman of all of Heinlein's stories. Maureen is also the name of Puddin, the teen girl he wrote about 30 years ago who has red hair, just like Heinlein's red-headed wife, Jenny. Whenever you see a woman with red hair or named Maureen in a Heinlein novel, it is probably inspired by Jenny Heinlein. Okay, here's my take on Heinlein and women. I don't think Heinlein understood women, but he really wanted to, and his writing reflects his journey in trying to understand women. I think his sexuality kind of got in the way. In other words, his heterosexuality and desire for women clouded how he viewed women. His views on gays is really opaque. There is some negative comments in Strange Land saying that being gay was sad, but then he seems to have changed his mind in later books, at least regarding gays. Maybe he was a 4 on the Kinsey scale, and maybe he experimented with a man before but didn't like it. In fact, one of his characters comes right out and says, I gave it a try, but it wasn't so great. I think intellectually he felt everyone was bisexual, but it was easier for him to imagine sex between women than between men, which I would say isn't uncommon among straight men. He played with how gender is a construct in The Moon is Our Mistress with the sentient computer who could be male or female or both or neither. And even in The Star Beast, he presented an alien race where there are multiple genders not based on the binary. I think it's interesting how his views changed with the times, but to me it felt like he couldn't quite overcome his preconceptions about women that he grew up with in the early 1900s. That he settled on benevolent sexism, that women are actually superior to men in some mystic way, is still a form of sexism. Because of that, I personally don't believe Heinlein wrote many believable women, with some exceptions, of course, like Podkayne of Mars. But hey, you may have a completely different opinion or outlook, which is fine. Please let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.